Welcome back. We're on deck. This is exam 79. We're going to attempt to cover questions 22 through 26, section 1, logical reasoning. Question 22 poses the following issue. Which one of the following most accurately describes the role played in the consumer advocate's argument by the claim that the willingness to pay is not proportional to need? With respect to role in the argument issues, maybe about 2 or 3 is typical. You probably want to highlight the operative language. Here that language is the willingness to pay is not proportional to need. And then you have to identify what role did that particular term or phrase or sentence play in the argument. I have my slash marks, and we'll see what I have here. The consumer advocate. Economists reason that price gouging, and then you have those dashes, so they're going to give you a definition. Increasing the price of goods when no alternative seller is available, that's price gouging. So economists reason that price gouging is efficient because it allocates goods to people whose willingness to pay more shows they really need those goods. So again, if you need to reread it, you reread it. If you need to paraphrase it, you paraphrase it, but you can't move on until you get it. So we have the consumer advocate representing what economists, or how economists reason with respect to price gouging, and they indicate, that is to say, that the economists believe it's sufficient, and the reason it's sufficient is because price gouging allocates goods to people whose willingness to pay more shows they really need the goods. Okay. But, next sentence, but the willingness to pay is not proportional to need. Now that's what our attention has been directed to. So stop there for a second. Is it fair to say, I mean, do we need this guy to say that right now the purpose of the second sentence is to refute the first sentence? I mean, is there any? So you stop, say, okay, that's at least part of this is, but the willingness to pay is not proportional to need is to say I disagree with what was just written. Now here we go from there. In the real world, some people simply cannot pay as much as others. Next sentence, as a result, a price increase will allocate goods to the people with the most money, not to those with the most need. So as you look at the answer choices, there's just no way they can, somewhere in this answer choice, it has to say that the purpose of what the willingness to pay is not proportional to need has got to be, in part, to refute that first sentence. So if you're looking at an answer choice where that's not there, it's not going to be the answer. Let's see what they did. Let's look at E, easy credited answer choice, and let's see whether we were in the weeds or not here. E says, it denies a claim. Does that, right? It denies the claim that was the first sentence. It denies a claim that the argument takes to be assumed in the reasoning that it rejects. And this is why they have a wine bar during the break, right? It's like, what was that all about? Okay, but you're briefing, so you get to break it down. So stop and say, well, it certainly denies a claim. And that the argument now refers to the consumer advocate, whose argument actually begins with that word but. So it denies a claim that the argument takes to be assumed. And the assumption there is when the consumer advocate says, but willingness to pay is not proportional to need, the consumer advocate is assuming that the economist would take that position. So it is denying a claim that the argument, now we're talking about the consumer advocate's argument, takes to be assumed in the reasoning that it rejects. That assumption, but the willingness to pay is not proportional, is part of the reasoning that the consumer advocate is offering, and that reasoning is there to reject the economist's position. And like, hello, if that's not a level 4 or a level 5, my hair's going to grow back. So don't worry about it. Don't sweat the details. If you're in over your head, get out. And here now, if we look at the other choices, to add insult to injury, In my mind, they made two of the other choices really quite competitive, which was the first. If you go down here and you say, well, if I read A says the answer is that it disputes one explanation in order to make way for an alternative explanation. And you sound, well, yeah, it kind of disputed what was up there. Well, okay, it did, but it didn't dispute the economist's explanation that price gouging is efficient in order to make way for an alternative explanation. In other words, in order for that to be accurate, then the consumer advocate would have to be saying there is an alternative explanation for why price gouging is efficient. And because, again, what the consumer advocate is saying, it's efficient because it allocates goods to people whose willingness to pay more shows they really need those goods. For A to be correct, if it disputes one explanation in order to make way for an alternative explanation, it would have to replace the explanation that the economist gave with an explanation of price gouging that the consumer advocate is placing in its place, and it didn't. I'm so fine if you picked A and you got it wrong. I mean, try not to do it again, but that's really tough. B, it is the overall conclusion. Again, there's almost no need to read B. If you understand this stuff, B is just not something you need any. It's not the conclusion. I mean, the conclusion of this is going to be the final sentence. Okay, C, it is a component of reasoning disputed in the argument. Again, I think C is, you sit and say, well, isn't it a component of reasoning? Well, no, because actually the reasoning begins with the consumer advocate's position, but the willingness to pay is not proportional to need. And then that's where this all begins. This is not a component of that reasoning that's disputed. This is a position that is to be rejected by the reasoning that the consumer advocate puts forward. And again, this is just nuts. If you're getting this one right, God bless you. So C is not. I don't believe C is not the answer, and I believe the reason is that it's not a component of the reasoning. It's the reasoning is set up to reject that first sentence. D, it is a general principle whose validity the argument questions. And again, that's not it. And if you have read the argument and not done the analysis, you're going to have to analyze each answer choice, and you're just toast. So that is not a general principle. It is a specific. It is the specific refutation of you. Just I'm refuting what was in front of what that first sentence was. A very heavy lift, I believe. 23. Which one of the following, if true, would most strengthen the argument? Okay. Slash marks. Stop at every slash mark. Slash marks at all that punctuation. Make sure you understand the law. Here it comes. So I want to strengthen the zoologist's argument. What is it? Plants preferentially absorb heavy nitrogen from rainwater. Who knew? Heavy nitrogen consequently becomes concentrated in the tissues of herbivores. I guess that's herbivores. I think pH is silent, but I really don't know. So the nitrogen, the heavy nitrogen, becomes concentrated in the tissues of herbivores, and animals that eat meat in turn exhibit even higher concentrations of heavy nitrogen in their bodily tissues. To stop, so the plants get the heavy nitrogen, and the animals that feed on the plants get the heavy nitrogen, and the animals that feed on the animals get heavy nitrogen. Okay, I got it. We compared bone samples from European cave bears of the Ice Age, okay, with blood samples from present-day bears fed meat-enriched diets. Okay, so you compared the bones from cave bears from the Ice Age with blood samples from present-day bears fed meat-enriched diets, and the levels of heavy nitrogen present in these samples was identical. Okay, so the heavy nitrogen in the cave bears from the Ice Age is identical with the blood samples, so the bone samples are identical with the blood samples, okay? And thus the prehistoric European cave bears were not exclusively herbivores. Okay, meaning they must have eaten. You want to make the case that they ate things just other than the plants, um, because the higher concentrations were that we found today. The higher concentrations come with animals that actually eat meat as well. And so you're saying since present day blood sample had higher concentrations, Ice Age bone sample is identical to the blood sample, then you're saying they must have eaten meat in the Ice Age. Um, this could be an assumption, because it could be anything they want it to be. But if you want to strengthen that, the reasoning is absolutely directing you to bone sample, blood sample, as well as that you want to say that the present day bears, right, are based, are absolutely the same as the European cave bears. You want to make sure there's no difference between a cave bear and a modern bear, right? And the other thing is there's a difference between blood and bone. I'm done. But that work has to be done before you ever look at the answer choices, which means you need to train your mind. Now go to the credited answer choice. D. Bone samples from present day bears fed meat-enriched diets exhibit the same levels of heavy nitrogen as do their blood sample. And absolutely, D is hitting on, you're analogizing bone to blood, and it's got to be the same. So that is nowhere near, to me, as heavy a lift as 22 was. But again, you're not going to look at D in the test. See, what you do is you take D, you arm yourself with this process of really becoming skilled at doing the analysis, so that when you read A, B, and C, you're dismissing them. A. Plants can absorb heavy nitrogen from a variety of sources other than rainwater. But that's not relevant. This argument is targeted. You've got to focus on the actual reasoning you were given. The reasoning really has to do with, I'm basing this conclusion on the bone sample comparison with the blood samples. So A's got nothing to do with that. B, the rate at which heavy nitrogen accumulated in the blood of Ice Age herbivores can be inferred from the samples of their bones. Okay, so you want to say in B that the rate, well, why do we care about the rate of heavy nitrogen? I don't know that we care about the rate that accumulated in the blood. Do we have any blood from the Ice Age? We don't have any blood, do we? We just have a bone sample. No. C. The same number of samples was taken from present-day bears as was taken from Ice Age cave bears. You need the same number. I mean, you have to have the exact. You have to have 14 of each. If you had the exact same number, I mean, it certainly wouldn't weaken the argument to have the exact same number, right? You say, well, it wouldn't weaken it, but would that really strengthen it? Well, it wouldn't really strengthen it if you had the exact same number, but you had different outcomes. So, again, you might read C on the actual test, having not gotten a D yet, and said, maybe that would be, maybe if you had the same number, it makes the sample seem more valid, or but not very compelling. And then E, the level of heavy nitrogen in the bones of any bear fed a meat-enriched diet is the same as that in the bones of any other meat-eating bear. Well, again, that's not helping me with the Ice Age. Here you're talking about the level in the bones of any bear is the same as that in the bones of any other, but we don't have bone to bone, we have bone to blood, so it's really not helping me. So the answer there is G. Question number 24. Which one of the following is an assumption required by the biologist's argument? Again, expect most of these final 7 or 8 questions to be reasonably heavy lifts that have a reasonably high failure. So which one of the following is an assumption required by the biologist's argument? Here you go. Put your slash marks in biologist. Some computer scientists imagine that all that is required for making an artificial intelligence is to create a computer program that encapsulates the information contained in the human genome. So you got to stop. Well, maybe you don't have to stop, but most of us would stop. I might want to reread that. So let me try again. Some computer scientists imagine that all that is required for making artificial intelligence is to create a computer program that encapsulates the information contained in the human genome. Now I got it right. So all I got to do is take the information in the human genome and we can create artificial intelligence. Now, the biologist says they are mistaken. That's my conclusion. The only thing left to read here is the reasoning for the conclusion. So they are mistaken. Let's find out why, according to the biologist, they are mistaken, and we want to affirm that. Here's what the biologist says. The operation of the human brain is governed by the interactions of proteins. Now, you notice we haven't heard anything about proteins until now. So that's important, right? So he says the operation of the human brain is governed by the interactions of proteins whose structures are encoded in the human genome. So the biologist is saying you can't just copy the genome, and the reason you can't just copy the genome is because the operation of the brain is governed by the interaction of the proteins. So that's got to be where the answer is. In other words, the answer's got to touch on proteins. Now, again, I don't know the words they're going to use, but it's going to be the assumption here, right, is that you can't get the proteins in that first sentence. In other words, if in the first sentence it included the proteins, right, then the argument would fail. So like encapsulating this stuff in a computer program, you can't get the protein, because if you can't get the protein, the biologist's argument would fail. So just spend time trying. If you can wrap your mind around this, do this. If you can, do it. If you can't, it's not going to keep you out of law school to get these ones wrong. Better if you can figure it out. Go directly to the correct answer choice. The interaction of the proteins that govern the operation of the human brain are not determined by the information contained in the human genome. And yeah, I mean, that's actually pretty compelling, because if that statement is true, if the proteins are governed by the genome, right, and you can copy the genome, well, then when you copy the genome, it's going to govern the proteins, which means you would be able to have the artificial intelligence would get it done. So B is clearly the answer to me. Again, what you're trying to do is you're trying to arm yourself looking at A, B, C, D, and E with the sense that this has got to have something to do with proteins, and that human genome, that artificial intelligence, and an answer choice that doesn't is to be dismissed. So now let's see what we have here. A, the functions of the human brain are governed by processes that cannot be simulated by a computer, and that's not the issue. The issue here is the proteins. Right? That's why this is the artificial intelligence has to fail. C, the only way to create artificial intelligence is to model it on the operation of the human brain. I have no clue whether it's the only way. And again, this is not, you got to have that protein in there. It doesn't have to be the assumptions. That's a pretty common answer choice, where they say somebody's assuming it's got to be the only way. That's not the case. Well, it's rarely the case. So this doesn't have to be the only way, and to create artificial intelligence. It's going to fail this way, and it's going to fail this way because of the protein. D, the amount of information contained in the human genome is too large to easily encapsulate by a computer program. Okay, so it can't be easily encapsulated. The answer is no. That's not an assumption required for the argument's validity. The assumption required, it's the proteins that are preventing it from getting done. That's got nothing to do with it. You've got to identify the issue. E, it is much more difficult to write a program that encapsulates the interactions of proteins than to write a program that encapsulates the information contained in the human genome. Well, at least there they have proteins in the human genome, but who cares that it's more difficult? That is not a statement that must be true for this conclusion to be valid. Who cares if it's more difficult or not? The author's saying it can't happen. Okay. So 24, the answer is B. 25. Which one of the following is most strongly supported by the information above? Slash marks, most strongly supported. It's just the most conservative inference you can possibly draw. So I have my slash marks, and here you go. Some advertisers, they offer certain consumers home computers free of charge. Okay, I got that. Advertisements play continuously on the computer screens whenever they're in use. Again, you don't need this guy, right? Everybody's got this. Okay, I got it. As consumers use the computers to browse the internet, information about their browsing patterns is sent to the advertisers, enabling them, the advertisers, to transmit to each consumer advertising that accurately reflects his or her individual interest. Okay, I got it. The advertisers can afford to offer the computers for free because of the increased sales, that result from this precise targeting of individual consumers. So now you're saying, so which of the following is most strongly supported by that? And again, you're not trying to get the words right, but it's like, well, then it must make sense to the advertisers to do this. If they can afford to do it. The thing that's not in here, right, that I would think would be in here, is if they can afford to do it, it must be the case that consumers, to some degree they act on this information. They just don't sit there and do nothing because they've got the computer for free, right? So in order for the advertisers to afford that, to offer the computer for free, they must be getting a return on their investment. Do I know what the words look like? No. But do I plan to recognize them when I see them? Absolutely. Do I plan to dismiss alternative choices with as little analysis as possible? Yes, I do. Okay. Here is the answer. What's most strongly supported here is that at least some consumers who use a computer offered free of charge by advertisers for browsing the internet. So I'm going to reread that because, again, they make the language very awkward. At least some consumers who use a computer offered free of charge by advertisers for browsing the internet, got it, spend more money on purchases from those advertisers than they would if they did not use such a computer to browse the internet. And yeah, of course that follows. I mean, if you didn't spend somewhat more money, it wouldn't be worth the advertiser's while to do it. So, I mean, again, to me, A is not a heavy lift. Now, again, I do think you have to keep reading on this issue, the issue of which of the following is most strongly supported by the information above. Any one of the 5 choices can be the answer. But for God's sake, you take A and you want to be a lawyer, you've got to have some confidence. You got to say, you know what, I'm like 99%, well, let's say 95% sure A is the answer. So I'm not agnostic. I'm looking to reject B, C, D, and E, and I want to do it in as little time as I need. Let me take a look at B. No advertisers could offer promotions that give away computers free of charge if consumers never use those computers to browse the internet. Well, okay, so no advertisers could afford promotions that give away computers free of charge if consumers never use those computers to browse the internet. Well, but that's really, that's not the issue here. The issue here is that they can afford to do it because there'll be increased sales that come from it. So this one that whether advertisers could offer promotion that give away computers free of charge if consumers never use the computers to browse the internet is not what's most strongly supported from this. What's most strongly supported, because it doesn't reach the issue of, the precise targeting that they can afford this. C. There are at least some consumers who browse the internet using computers offered free of charge by the advertisers, and who, if they did not use those computers to browse the internet, would spend little, if any money on the purchases from the advertisers. The issue is not what they would have done had they not seen the advertising. That's not relevant. The only thing relevant is they see the advertising, and because the advertisers can afford to do this, the consumer must be purchasing something. D. The advertisers would not be able to offer the computers absolutely free of charge if advertisements that accurately reflected the interest of the computer's users did not play continuously across the computer screens whenever they are in use. You can infer that, but you don't know that. You can, you can infer that really what's making this work is that they play continuously, but maybe if they didn't play continuously, people would still purchase the products. So again, you can infer D, you can infer B. They're just not the thing that's most strongly supported by the information above, which really is, that somebody must be buying something. And E. Consumers who use a computer offered free of charge by the advertisers can sometimes choose to abstain from having information about their browsing patterns sent to the advertisers. And if you pick E, don't do it again. He's not even close. So again, I think it's challenging. I think I would have read A and I would have been fortified by A. I do think that for me, I think B is the closest of the choices, but A is the answer. And number 26 is our exit question. The flawed reasoning in which one of the following is most similar to the argument above. Okay, so it's a parallel flaw. Let's see if we can pick up the reasoning in the argument here. And again, you got to slow down and say, do I see how the reasoning proceeds? So it says here that some eloquent speakers impress their audiences with the vividness and clarity of the messages conveyed. So stop, and since you're in the world of parallel, you're saying some of one group have the ability to do something else. So can you see that some A accomplish B? Okay, now you just got to remember that when you're doing the A is the eloquent speaker, right? And the B is the ability to be clear. Okay, next. So some A can accomplish B. Now, next sentence is referring to speakers. Okay, speakers who resort to obscenity, however, are not genuinely eloquent. So now we're talking about a group that's not A, right? I mean, because we're talking about eloquent speakers, and they can be vivid, right? And now we're talking about, we're told that people who use obscenity are not eloquent. So you can either say not A, or you can say, like, that's a different group of people. So you can say C, right? This group of who are not eloquent. They're not eloquent, and so none of these speakers can impress their audience. So I would say, the way I would break this down, and you might need to write it down, I'd have here, some eloquent speakers impress their audience with vividness and clarity. It says some A achieve B. Next sentence. Speakers who resort to obscenity, however, are not eloquent speakers. So if you say, take that clause, right, that speakers who resort to obscenity, okay, that's C, that's group C, right? And they never get to be A, so they're never eloquent speakers. And then the outcome here is, so none of these speakers, and they're talking when they say none of these speakers are talking about the folks who refer to obscenity, none of those speakers impress their audiences, and that would be no C achieves B. So if you had that written down, it would be some A achieve B, all C are not A, and then therefore no C achieves B. You don't have to be doing, you can stay with the text. If you can follow with the text, that's perfectly fine. This is a way to break it down. And I would give close attention to the words like some, all, none. That's what's likely to be repeated. So let's see if we can see the same flawed reasoning. And here it's in choice E. In choice E says, sculptors sometimes produce significant works of art. Okay, so sculptors sometimes do it. They don't always do it. So some A achieve B, right? Which B being the significant words of art. But musicians are not sculptors. So now you're saying, well, wait a minute, this is class C, right, that are not A. So again, you're analogizing here to the musicians are not sculptors is analogous to the speakers who resort to obscenities are not genuinely eloquent. So here it's, but musicians are not sculptors. That's saying all C are not A. All the musicians, none of them are not sculptors. Hence, or therefore, musicians never produce significant works of art. So now we're staying with C, and it says no C achieves B. So it's identical in its form. Again, I think when you get to, for me, when I'm in the world of the 20s, for good or for ill, I'm attacking. I understand that the percent that I'm likely to get right is going to go down. In other words, what you want to do is, questions 1 through 12, you want to be shooting for 70% or 80% or 90% or 100% of getting them right. And then when you get here, for most people, you need a more realistic perspective. So if you're only shooting to get 35% right or 40% right or even 50% right, you get to pick and choose. And then I would just be very aggressive on, I would be reading A, E, D, C, B when I get into this area. Because it just seems to me that helps. If nothing else, the psychology, it makes you feel in control. So if we look here at the other choices, all you got to do is got to be some A achieve B, right? And here we start with A. A culture without myths will also lack fundamental moral certainties. Thus, this culture must lack fundamental moral certainties since it is devoid of myth. And it's not at all following the same pattern. B, there are authors who write 1 page a day and produce 1 book per year. There are authors who write 1 page a day and produce. So there are some authors who do that. Serious authors, however, do not write 1 page a day. So some authors who write 1 book a day, who write 1 book a year are not serious. Break it down. If you go with this, do we get some A achieve B? So in B you have there are authors who write 1 page a day, okay, some A achieve B, and produce 1 book a year. So I guess that's all in the same. Serious authors. So now we're talking about serious authors. So let's call them C. However, do not write 1 page per day. So some authors who write 1 book a year are not serious, and you're not following those last, it's not going from all C to staying with all C. In other words, for B to have the same form, it would have to repeat serious authors in both at the end, and it doesn't. C, cities that are center of commerce are always centers of industry as well, okay? But that's not some A or B, they're all. So I'm done. I mean, I'll keep reading it, but that's already gone. Cities that are centers of commerce are always cities of industry as well. It follows that some centers of commerce are small cities, since there are centers of industries that are not small cities. And the answer is it's not, again, it's not following. Just write down some A achieve B, all C are not A, therefore no C achieves B, and neither A nor B nor C is following that. And D, we go from some A to here is most farmers like living in rural areas. It's not most, it's some. So it says here most like living in rural areas. Since Carla is not a farmer, she probably would not enjoy living in the country. That's not following the same pattern. So the answer to 26 is E, and we're done.